Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to give you that essential shortcut, helping you gain knowledge quickly, but also thoroughly.
That's the goal.
And today, we're really tackling something fundamental. We're going deep into the theories behind political action, political behavior.
Yeah, the core ideas political scientists use to figure out why people do what they do in the political arena.
Right, everything from why someone votes a certain way to how a world leader might handle a negotiation. It's about motivations.
And it's a really fascinating intellectual journey, actually. We're going to trace how the field moved, from thinking it was all about self-interest, all rational calculation.
The sort of economic man idea applied to politics.
Exactly. And how that view evolved to bring in psychology, social norms, the rules people follow almost without thinking. It's a much richer picture now.
So this really is a deep dive for anyone, for you if you want to get beyond just the surface level stuff.
Absolutely. Our mission here is to pull out those key theoretical nuggets, the big shifts, the core concepts.
And we should mention our sources. We're leaning heavily on some foundational work here.
We are. Primarily, it's the overview of political behavior, which is chapter 17 in the Oxford Handbook of Political Science.
Okay.
And we're also drawing on some related expanded summary materials that dig into these concepts even further.
Good. So we've got solid ground to cover. We want to really understand the tools political scientists use to study what they often call the constrained use of social power.
That's the phrase. And understanding those tools, those theoretical building blocks, it's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about getting real clarity on the concepts themselves.
Okay, so let's start right there with that definition you just mentioned. Politics as the constrained use of social power. Sounds simple, but unpack that a bit. Why constrained?
Well, that word constrained is doing a lot of work. It's really the key.
How so?
Because if power wasn't constrained, if it was just, raw force or someone's whim with no limits, then studying politics would look very different. It might just be history, maybe biography.
Right, just describing events or powerful people.
Exactly. But power is channeled, it's structured, it operates within limits set by rules, both formal laws and informal norms, by institutions, by what people believe is legitimate.
Okay, those are the constraints.
Those are the constraints. And understanding how those constraints work, how they shape what people can and can't do, how they influence political behavior.
Yeah.
That's what political science is fundamentally about.
Got it. And the people who study this, political scientists, our sources point out this kind of interesting split, almost a tension in how they see their own role. It goes way back, apparently.
Oh, absolutely. It's a long-standing dichotomy. You can think of it as two main camps, or maybe two tendencies within the discipline.
Okay.
On one side, you've got the political scientists who act essentially as counselors to power. Think of them as the modern versions of Machiavelli, maybe.
Advising the prince.
Kind of, yeah. Their focus is on advising governments or parties or movements that currently hold power or want to. How do you win? How do you govern effectively? How do you manage the system? They're sort of on the accommodative end of things.
Okay, working within the existing structures. And the other side?
The other side takes a more critical stance. These scholars often draw inspiration from thinkers like, say, Marx. Their focus isn't advising power, but critiquing it.
Analyzing inequality, maybe?
Yeah.
Pointing out problems?
Exactly. Looking at structural issues, highlighting injustices, questioning the legitimacy of the powers that be. So you've got this constant tension. Advise power or critique power.
And you can probably see that in the research people publish.
Oh, definitely. You can often tell where an author sits on that spectrum, from accommodative to critical. It shapes the questions they ask and the answers they find. It's sort of baked into the discipline's history.
Okay, so moving from the role of the scientist to the ideas themselves, let's talk about the behavioral revolution. This sounds like a huge shift.
It was massive, probably the biggest intellectual shift in 20th century political science.
And the core idea, you said, was simple.
Deceptively simple. The catch cry was basically, don't just look at the formal rules, look at what people actually do. Focus on observable behavior, not just constitutions or laws on paper.
That seems obvious now, maybe?
It does seem obvious now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. It really took hold and became dominant in the 1950s. But here's the fascinating part, the nugget our sources really emphasize.
What's that?
The time lag, this big thing, the simple idea that changed the field. It was built using intellectual tools, raw materials that were actually decades old by then.
Wait, really? So political science was adopting ideas that were already old news elsewhere.
In some ways, yeah. The big push was in the 50s, but the key studies, the foundations, were laid earlier. Think about the early voting studies from the 1940s. Lazarsfeld, Berelsen, Godet. Or even going back further, works like Merriman Gosnell's study on why people didn't vote back in 1924. These insights were often drawn from psychology and sociology. And as the Oxford Handbook chapter points out, the behavioral movement was often kind of past its peak in psychology by the time it really became the dominant force in political science.
Wow. So academic revolutions aren't always cutting edge. They recycle old stuff.
They often use antiquated raw materials, as the source puts it, and that matters. It really does.
Why does it matter for someone studying this today?
Because it helps explain why political science sometimes seems to be fighting intellectual battles that other fields, like psychology or cognitive science, might feel they've moved past.
Like there's a disconnect.
There can be. When political science finally embraced behavioralism, it kind of locked in certain frameworks. So sometimes, contemporary political scientists might struggle to directly engage with the very latest research in, say, neuroscience or behavioral economics, because the dominant paradigms within political science are still grappling with slightly older frameworks. It's a structural thing about how ideas spread between disciplines.
That makes a lot of sense. It clarifies some of the internal debates you see. Okay, so we had these big field-changing ideas, the big things like behavioralism. How do we categorize these different levels of theory?
Right, so the big things are those really foundational ideas. They're simple, you can usually sum them up quickly, but they have huge ramifications. Behavioralism is one.
Any others?
Systems theory is another classic example. The core idea there is basically everything is connected, feedback matters. It gives you a whole worldview for analyzing politics.
Okay, defines the universe.
Yeah.
And then you have smaller ideas.
Yeah, what the sources call medium-sized things, or sometimes theories of the middle range. These aren't grand theories about everything. They're more like specific tools or concepts.
Essential tools, though.
Absolutely essential. They let scholars actually do the research, specify the mechanisms at work, and you can kind of mix and match them.
Example.
Things like the new institutionalism, that's a big one. It emphasizes how rules, both formal and informal, really shape behavior over time. They persist.
Okay.
Or social capital, the idea of networks, trust, reciprocity, how that helps people cooperate.
Right. And path dependency, that comes up a lot.
Path dependency, yeah. That's the idea that choices made early on, maybe even small, seemingly random choices, can kind of lock things in.
How so?
Well, they create costs to changing course later. Even if a better option comes along, it might be too expensive or disruptive to switch back. The classic non-political example is the QWERTY keyboard layout.
Ah, right. Not the most efficient, but we're stuck with it.
Yeah. Exactly. Politically, think about a country's basic constitutional choices, like did they choose a parliamentary system or a presidential one early on? That sets a track, a path, that's really hard to deviate from later, shaping political development for decades or centuries.
So these medium-sized theories help us analyze specific processes without having to reinvent the wheel every time.
Precisely. They let us catalog progress, test specific mechanisms, build knowledge piece by piece.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, switching gears a bit, but still foundational, let's talk normative theory, because how we think things should be inevitably colors how we see things as they are.
Absolutely. Our normative assumptions, our ideas about justice or the good society, they frame everything else.
And the material lays out three main schools of thought here in terms of contemporary social theory.
That's right. Three broad ways of thinking about what holds society together or what makes it just. First, you've got conflict theory.
Okay. Based on?
Fundamentally based on interests. It sees society as an arena where different groups are constantly competing for scarce resources, for power, for status. Social order is often seen as imposed by dominant groups.
Got it. Competing interests. What's the second?
Second is shared value theory. This is often linked to sociologists like Talcott Parsons.
And the idea here?
The idea here is that social order comes primarily from people sharing broad collective values, things like patriotism or religious beliefs or a commitment to democracy. These shared values are seen as overriding purely selfish individual interests.
So consensus is key.
Consensus on core values, yes.
Yeah.
It's what provides the social glue, explaining things like why people cooperate or feel national unity, even when it might not seem immediately in their individual self-interest.
And the third school?
The third is exchange theory, which is also sometimes called contractarian theory.
Based on agreement.
Exactly, based on agreement or contract. The classic example here is the philosopher John Rawls and his idea of the veil of ignorance.
Ah, yes. Explain that briefly.
Rawls asks us to imagine people choosing the basic principles of justice for their society, but doing it from behind a veil of ignorance. Meaning, they don't know what their own position in that society will be, rich or poor, talented or not, majority or minority. Because they don't know their own place, Rawls argues. They'll rationally choose principles that are fair to everyone, especially the least advantaged, because they might end up being in that position themselves.
So order and justice emerge from a kind of rational bargain, a hypothetical contract.
Precisely. Not necessarily from shared deep values or from conflict, but from a rational agreement on the rules of the game.
Okay, those are three really distinct ways of looking at it. But the sources seem to suggest that a lot of modern political theory kind of leans away from the shared values idea.
That's a crucial point, yes. While shared values clearly matter sometimes, much of modern social and political theory tends to see social order primarily as a problem of coordination.
Coordination?
Coordination among individuals and groups who have different, often conflicting interests and values. This view has deep roots, going back to thinkers like Hobbes and Hume, and later people like Lindblom.
So it's more about managing disagreement than achieving deep consensus.
Exactly. It's fundamentally an interest-based theory, but focused on coordination. The idea is we don't necessarily need everyone to agree on the ultimate good life to have a functioning society. What we need are rules and institutions that allow people with diverse goals to coordinate their actions and avoid, crashing into each other.
Can you give a concrete example of that kind of coordination in politics?
Sure. Think about something as basic as traffic laws.
Yeah.
You might have one driver who's in a huge rush trying to get somewhere fast, and another driver who's just enjoying a leisurely drive, maybe sightseeing. They have very different interests regarding speed.
Right, conflicting interests.
But they both agree to stop at red lights. Why? Not because they suddenly share a deep philosophical belief about the virtue of stopping.
Because the alternative is chaos.
Yeah.
An accident.
Exactly. The alternative, crashing, is worse for both of them. The traffic light is a coordination device. It allows people with different interests to manage their interactions predictably.
I see.
So when modern political theory looks at things like democracy or international relations or even market economies, it's often asking, how do we set up rules and institutions that allow diverse, pluralistic groups to coordinate effectively to achieve some minimum level of order so they can then pursue their different goals without constant conflict? It's less about forcing everyone to share the same values.
That idea of coordinating different interests, it seems like a perfect lead-in to the whole debate about the democratic citizen, the voter.
It really is.
Because for a long time, the ideal was the super-informed citizen, someone who knew all the issues, followed all the debates.
The sort of civics textbook ideal, right? The omnicompetent citizen.
Yeah. But our sources really push back against that, suggesting it's maybe not realistic or even necessary.
They challenge it with a big dose of pragmatism. There's a great analogy used. Voters may know very little about the workings of the internal combustion engine, but they do know how to drive.
Huh. I like that. What's the point there?
The point is, maybe we're measuring the wrong thing. Maybe the important question isn't whether the average voter can write a dissertation on fiscal policy,
Right.
but whether they have enough functional knowledge, enough practical skill, enough shortcuts to make a reasonable choice in the voting booth. A choice that, when you add it up with everyone else's reasonable choices, leads to a reasonably sensible outcome for the democracy as a whole.
So shift the focus from encyclopedic knowledge to functional competence.
Exactly. How do people actually navigate the political world and make choices, given that information is costly and time is limited?
And that cost of information brings us to a really famous concept, rational ignorance. You mentioned Anthony Downs earlier.
Yes, Downes's argument from an economic theory of democracy back in 1957 was groundbreaking and still incredibly influential.
So what is rational ignorance? It sounds like an oxymoron. Is it smart to be dumb?
Well, rational in the economic sense. Downes argued that if you think like a purely rational, self-interested actor, you'd calculate the costs and benefits of becoming informed about politics.
Okay.
The cost is significant. Time, effort, maybe buying newspapers or books. The benefit, well, the chance that your single individual vote will actually be the deciding vote in a large election is infinitesimally small.
Basically zero.
Pretty much negligible. So from a purely instrumental cost-benefit perspective, the payoff for investing heavily in political information is tiny. Therefore, Downs argued, it is perfectly rational for the average citizen to choose to remain relatively ignorant about the fine details of many policies.
Wow. Okay, so if most people are rationally ignorant, how does democracy even function? Why doesn't this fall apart into random noise?
That's the crucial next step. People don't maximize their information, but they optimize it. They find ways to make decent choices without incurring huge information costs. They rely heavily on shortcuts, information shortcuts, cues, heuristics, rules of thumb. Even emotions can act as signals.
So mental shortcuts to simplify complex decisions.
Precisely. Samuel Popkin called this gut-level rationality. It's about using readily available cues to make a judgment that's likely good enough, even if it's not perfectly informed.
What kinds of cues are we talking about?
Oh, lots of things. Party labels are huge, obviously. Endorsements, who does a trusted group or public figure support, maybe focusing on a candidate's character or their perceived group affiliations. Sometimes it's just a general feeling about whether things are going well or badly retrospective voting.
So the argument isn't that voters are dumb, it's that they're efficient information processors.
You could put it that way. They're cognitive misers trying to make reasonable choices with the least amount of mental effort. And the interesting claim is that these shortcuts, while imperfect at the individual level, often work surprisingly well in the aggregate. Well, if millions of voters are using these kinds of cues, the random errors might cancel each other out, and the collective signal, the election outcome, can still reflect the underlying preferences of the electorate reasonably well. It leads to reasonable democratic outcomes, even without perfectly informed individuals.
That's a fascinating idea. And you mentioned party labels as a huge shortcut. That seems key.
Absolutely central, especially in countries with stable party systems. Parties serve this incredibly practical function. They bundle issues together, they offer distinct platforms, they basically pre-digest a lot of political information for the voter.
They structure the choices.
They structure the choices exactly. It dramatically reduces the information processing costs. You don't need to research every single candidate on every single issue if you have a general sense of what the Democratic or Republican Party stands for.
So partisanship isn't just blind loyalty, it's a tool.
It functions as a powerful cognitive tool. V.O. Key had that famous phrase for it back in 1966. Partisanship as a standing decision.
A standing decision.
Yeah, like a default setting. For many voters, their party identification is the starting point, the anchor for how they evaluate candidates, issues, and political events. It's a schema, a mental framework that helps organize the political world.
And this is where, you mentioned earlier, different schools of thought kind of converge.
Yeah.
Rational choice and psychology.
Yes, it's a really interesting point of agreement. Scholars coming from the rational choice tradition look at partisanship or ideology and say, look, this functions as an informational shortcut. It saves people the cost of gathering and analyzing detailed information.
Okay, the economic logic.
Right. And then you have social cognitive psychologists using completely different methods and theories, and they arrive at basically the same place. They talk about party ID as a powerful heuristic, a schema that filters information and guides judgments automatically.
So different languages, same phenomena.
Pretty much. Whether you call it an economic shortcut or a psychological filter, the function is the same. Simplifying a very complex, multidimensional political reality into something more manageable for the average person.
But this vital link between voters and parties, it seems like it's under stress these days. The sources talk about a kind of organizational detachment.
Yes, that's a major theme in contemporary research. There are sort of two parallel trends happening.
What are they?
First, just generally weaker partisan identification in many established democracies. Fewer people feel that really strong, lifelong, I am a Democrat, Republican, period kind of identity. More independence, more switching.
Okay, weaker personal ties.
And second, maybe even more concerning for the link, is evidence of a growing gap between the actual policy preferences voters tell pollsters they have and the policies being proposed in the official party manifestos or platforms.
So the parties aren't quite reflecting what the voters, even their own potential voters, seem to want.
There's evidence suggesting that gap is widening in some areas. The parties might be driven more by activists or donors or their own internal dynamics.
And what's the consequence of this detachment?
The most direct, measurable consequence is more electoral volatility.
Meaning people switching their votes more often.
Exactly. The sources point out this steady increase in votes switching from one election to the next over the last, say, 40 years or so. When people feel less anchored to a party, they become swing voters almost by default.
And that must change how parties govern, right?
It certainly seems to. The data suggests a pretty clear trend starting around the 1970s towards more centrist governments in power.
Why centrist?
Well, if the electorate is more volatile, parties feel pressured to appeal to that elusive median voter, the person in the middle. So even parties that are historically quite left or quite right, once they get into power, they often moderate their policies to try and hold on to that shifting center ground.
Interesting. So detachment leads to volatility, which pushes governments towards the center.
That seems to be the dynamic. And ironically, the centrist drift is often helped along by modern political marketing techniques aimed at broad audiences. But it can also increase the distance between the party's hardcore activists and the average, less aligned voter.
It sounds like the nature of political participation itself is changing too then, if people aren't as tied to parties.
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. While traditional measures like formal party membership might be declining in many places.
Suggesting maybe a loss of faith in those old structures.
Perhaps, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are less engaged overall. Engagement is just taking different forms.
Like what?
We see a definite rise in what's called cause-oriented activism. Think large-scale protests and demonstrations, consumer politics like choosing products based on ethics or boycotts.
Online activism?
And definitely online activism. Social media allows for incredibly rapid mobilization around specific issues or causes, often completely outside traditional party channels.
So democracy is adapting, finding new ways for people to participate.
You could say that. It shows the flexibility of democratic systems. Participation evolves. Power and pressure can be exerted more directly by citizens, sometimes bypassing those traditional party gatekeepers altogether.
Okay, so we've laid out the rational choice view voters as maybe not perfectly informed, but rational optimizers using shortcuts like party ID. But that's not the whole story, is it? The next big turn involves bringing psychology much more centrally into the picture.
Right. This is the psychological turn, and it really complicates things, often by challenging the very idea that rational calculation is the gold standard for understanding political choice.
How so? What's the main challenge?
It brings emotion and affect feelings, moods, gut reactions right to the forefront. The argument is that these aren't just, noise interfering with rational thought. They might be central to how we make political judgments.
So feeling overthinking, sometimes.
Or maybe shaping thinking in ways we don't even realize. Contemporary political psychology questions whether that classic model, weigh the pros and cons, calculate utility, make a choice, is really how most political decisions get made.
But isn't emotion really hard to study systematically? If people can't even articulate why they feel a certain way.
That's the huge methodological hurdle. It's a massive challenge. A lot of psychological research now suggests that emotional responses, affect, can happen incredibly quickly, often below the level of conscious awareness.
So asking someone, why did you vote that way, might not get at the real reason.
It might get you a rationalization after the fact, or it might only capture really strong conscious emotions. But the subtler, faster, maybe even unconscious affective cues that might have actually driven the choice, those are much harder to access through simple self-reports.
The sources say emotion often produces choices without introspectively transparent deliberation.
Exactly. You don't always have access to your own underlying motivations. And if the scientists can't reliably measure those motivations, it makes building causal theories really difficult.
This difficulty, this lack of transparency, it seems connected to the idea of framing effects. How choices are presented matters hugely.
Absolutely. Framing effects are one of the most robust findings in behavioral decision research, and they directly challenge classical rationality.
Give an example.
The classic is the gain frame versus loss frame. Imagine a new disease outbreak. If you tell people a public health program will definitively save 200 out of 600 people, they tend to support it strongly. That's a gain frame.
Okay.
But if you tell another group the exact same program means 400 out of 600 people will definitively die, support often plummets. That's a loss frame.
Even though the outcome is identical, 200 saved means 400 die.
Identical. But framing it in terms of losses triggers different psychological responses, like loss aversion. People react differently depending purely on how the choice is described, which violates the idea that we have stable preferences based on objective outcomes.
But you said framing models alone are incomplete.
Right. This is a critical limitation pointed out in our sources. A framing model can show that framing mattered, that it changed the outcome, but it doesn't by itself explain why people reacted differently to the two frames.
It needs more.
It has to be supplemented with a deeper understanding of the underlying psychological mechanisms. Things like, as I said, loss aversion, or maybe pattern recognition or anchoring biases. Why did this specific frame trigger that specific psychological response in this context? You need the psychology to explain the framing effect, not just observe it.
Okay, so to get away from this purely calculating individual, the Homo economicus model, political science, looked towards institutionalism and found a different way people operate, the logic of appropriateness.
Yes, this concept, really popularized by James March and Johan Olsen, offers a fundamentally different logic for behavior. It moves away from calculation of consequences.
So what's the core question for someone operating under this logic?
Instead of asking, what are the consequences of my actions for my goals, the actor asks something more like, what kind of situation is this? What is my role here? And what does a person like me in this role do in this situation?
So it's about identity and rules, not outcomes.
Primarily, yes. People follow rules, scripts, repertoires of practices that are tied to their identity and the institutional context they're in. They try to act in ways that are seen as legitimate, as appropriate for their role, rather than constantly calculating expected utility. The key words are similarity and congruence. Does this action fit my role? Not likelihood and value. What outcome does this action produce?
Can you contrast that sharply with the rational choice logic, the logic of consequence? Maybe use an example.
Sure. Let's take your example of a bureaucrat reviewing, say, a complex application for some government benefit.
Okay.
The purely logic of consequence actor looks at the application and thinks, what decision maximizes my utility? Maybe approving it quickly gets it off my desk. Maybe denying it avoids potential controversy that could hurt my career. Maybe approving it pleases my boss. They calculate the consequences for themselves.
The outcome drives the decision.
Right. Now, the logic of appropriateness actor looks at the same application and asks different questions. What is the standard operating procedure for reviewing this type of application in this department? What are the official rules and guidelines? What does my identity as an impartial civil servant require me to do here?
Following the book.
Exactly. They meticulously follow the established rules and procedures, focusing on fulfilling the duties of their role correctly, even if that process seems inefficient, or even if they personally think a different outcome might be better in some abstract sense. Conforming to the rule-based identity is the priority.
So this logic helps explain why institutions, like bureaucracies, often seem so stable, so rule-bound, sometimes even rigid.
It absolutely does. Rules get encoded through experience, through socialization within the institution. They stabilize expectations. People learn this is how we do things here. Institutions become, in a sense, carriers of historical experience, shaping behavior by defining what's appropriate.
They create a bias in the system.
A bias, yes. A set of privileged ways of acting, thinking, deciding. But, and this is a really crucial nuance, the sources emphasize the logic of appropriateness is morally neutral. Meaning the rules being followed don't have to be good rules. Following the logic of appropriateness can lead to acts of incredible moral heroism. Think of a firefighter following procedures to save lives, despite immense personal risk. Their role demands it.
Okay.
But the same logic, doing what is deemed appropriate for one's role within a specific group or institution, can also underpin horrific atrocities. Think of bureaucrats meticulously organizing ethnic cleansing because those actions have become defined as the appropriate duty within that specific pathological normative system. The logic itself doesn't guarantee morality.
That's a sobering point. So the political system isn't just one logic or the other. It's often these competing logics, competing institutions and rules bumping up against each other.
Exactly. Politics often happens in the collision zones between different institutional structures, different sets of norms, different logics of action.
Which brings us to this interplay between the structures, the rules, the institutions, and the individuals acting within them. Agency and structure. Bob Jessup's idea comes in here.
Yes, the sociologist Bob Jessup had a very useful concept to capture this dynamic. He argued strongly against treating structure, the rules, context, and agency, individual action, as totally separate things.
They influence each other.
Deeply. He said structures are strategically selective.
Strategically selective, meaning
Meaning the rules and institutions aren't neutral. They inherently make it easier for certain actors using certain strategies, pursuing certain goals, to succeed compared to others. They privilege some paths, some identities, while closing off or disadvantaging others. The structure itself shapes the strategic landscape.
okay, the structure sets the stage, favors certain plays, and the actor.
The individual actor or group assesses the strategically selective context. They perform what Jessup called a strategic context analysis, basically figuring out, given these rules, given who holds power, what are my best options? Which strategies are likely to work here?
Makes sense.
But then, and this is the dialectic part, their actions, based on that analysis, inevitably change the context, even if only slightly. They might reinforce the structure or challenge it or subtly alter it.
And that changed context requires a new assessment.
Exactly. The structure changes, so the actors have to reassess their strategies, and their new actions change the context again. It's this ongoing, back and forth, mutually constitutive process. A dialectic of structures and strategies, as Jessup termed it, action shapes structure, which shapes the next action.
That feels like a much more dynamic picture of politics. But it leads down another complex path. The sources call it the endogenous institutions rabbit hole.
Ah, yes, the rabbit hole. It's a deep one.
What's the problem here?
The problem arises when you fully embrace the idea that institutions aren't just fixed background features. If they aren't given, if they themselves are the result of political action and strategic maneuvering, well, then you have to explain where they came from in the first place.
You have to explain the origin of the rules.
Exactly. And this connects to that provocative claim by William Riker back in 1980 that institutions are essentially congealed tastes.
Congealed tastes, meaning
Meaning they're just the preferences and power balances from previous rounds of political conflict now solidified into rules. If you accept that,
then you have to go back further.
you're forced back to trying to understand the pre-strategic preferences, the raw interests, the structural conditions that existed before those particular rules were put in place. What were the tastes before they congealed?
And why is that a rabbit hole? It sounds like infinite regress.
It risks becoming one. Because if you strip away the institutions, the rules, the constraints, you risk ending up back in what the sources call the chaos of institution-free politics, meaning you're back to just raw preferences bumping against each other. And political theory tells us that when you have multiple actors with diverse preferences across multiple issues, without strong institutional rules to structure the choices, outcomes become incredibly unstable, unpredictable, potentially chaotic. Think about problems of cycling preferences, Arrow's theorem, multidimensionality.
Right, the aggregation problems. Without rules, it's hard to get any stable outcome.
Precisely. So we need the institutions, the constraints, to explain stable political behavior and outcomes. But if the institutions themselves are just outcomes of prior politics, we seem to need to explain politics without institutions to explain the institutions.
A real theoretical bind. How do analysts deal with it?
The main way is by resisting the urge for universal, abstract models, and instead indexing explanations much more heavily to specific historical context. You don't try to explain all institutions from first principles. You analyze how these particular institutions arose from that specific prior context, acknowledging the contingency and path dependency involved. You trade generality for contextual depth. Hashtag outro.
So wrapping this up, we've covered a huge amount of ground today, really tracing the evolution of how political science thinks about behavior.
We really have, from those relatively simple, clean models based on rational self-interest.
Like rational ignorance, using parties as shortcuts.
Right. All the way to these much more complex, messy, context-heavy models that bring in psychology, emotions, rules, identity, the logic of appropriateness.
It feels like the core tension is between that desire for simplicity, for parsimony in our theories, and the need for descriptive accuracy, for capturing the complexity of how real people actually operate in the political world.
That's exactly the tension. Rational choice gives you elegance, often predictive power, abstract models that can travel. But the psychological and institutional approaches offer, a richer, maybe more realistic picture of the citizen embedded in culture, history, and specific situations. They often feel more true to life, but they can be harder to generalize.
And for you, the listener, trying to build that deep knowledge base, the key takeaway is understanding that these aren't always mutually exclusive ways of seeing the world. Sometimes they're different tools, different lenses, appropriate for different questions.
Right. It's about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, knowing when to apply which lens. It's that constant trade-off between simplicity and complexity that defines so much of social science.
Now, to leave you with something to think about, let's connect this back to a really tough practical problem in politics. Fostering political tolerance.
Ah, yes. This is where some of the research findings are quite challenging. Remember, the bedrock idea of liberal democracy is that you need a marketplace of ideas. All ideas, even ones you deeply disagree with, have to be allowed to compete.
Which requires citizens to be tolerant, right? To put up with that with which one disagrees, as the saying goes. Even speak to groups they find offensive.
Exactly. And the implicit hope, often, is that through open discussion, through reasoned argument, the better ideas, tolerance, democracy, respect will naturally win out, that we can persuade the intolerant.
But the research doesn't quite bear that out.
That's the really difficult finding our sources allude to. Decades of research have actually struggled significantly to find arguments or interventions that reliably and consistently convert people who hold intolerant views into genuinely embracing political tolerance. It's much harder than we might hope.
And there's an asymmetry.
There seems to be, yes. Worryingly, arguments for intolerance, arguments that play on fear or group identity or prejudice, often seem to be more psychologically potent, more effective at persuasion than arguments for tolerance, which often rely on abstract principles.
Wow. That suggests the marketplace of ideas might not be a level playing field. It might actually be tilted against tolerance.
That's the unsettling possibility. It suggests that maybe democratic discourse, left to its own devices, doesn't automatically generate the tolerant attitudes needed to sustain itself. Which leaves us with a really profound and open question.
Which is?
If rational argument and open debate aren't enough to cultivate tolerance, especially when arguments for intolerance are so potent, what does work? Where does political theory and democratic practice go from here to ensure the survival of tolerant, open societies? It's a critical question with no easy answers.
A challenging thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.